Good morning. Today I will be presenting my paper, Information about Inequality and Support for Redistribution, which is joint work with Christina Bicchieri and Jana Freund. Traditional political economy models predict that in democracies, greater inequality should lead to greater taxation on the rich and to more redistribution. However, this has not been the case. In the US, inequality has increased since the 1960s and taxation has not. Although there's a number of explanations in the literature about why this might be the case, we're going to focus on the last that I list here, which is that people might misperceive inequality, right? So the question then is whether providing more information about inequality changes preferences for distribution. So by asking this question, we address a growing literature about information and preferences for distribution. And typically this literature tells people where they are in the income distribution or provides physical reminders of inequality, um, and then measures the impact of this on people's preferences for distribution. In contrast, we're going to provide information about accumulation of income at the top 1%, at the bottom 50% of the distribution. And we're also going to provide incentives in a different treatment for people to overcome like cognitive and ideological biases for which they might be misperceiving inequality. Then we're also going to measure the impact of on change of these things on both perceptions of fairness and redistributive policy preferences. So we recruited over 2,800 subjects on Prolific, and we're going to measure our outcomes on a 0 to 100 scale. And in our survey experiment, after measuring people's demographics, we're going to measure the outcomes first, and we're going to present people with the treatments. Then we're going to ask them to state their beliefs about how much inequality they believe there is. And then we are going to measure the outcomes again. So we're going to mostly focus on the diff and the outcomes, which are a measure of fairness of the income distribution in the US. We're also going to ask them a question about whether federal income taxes on the richest 1% should increase, whether government welfare should increase, whether donations to charity by the top 1% should increase, whether charity welfare assistance should be increased, and we're also going to have a behavioral measure of donation to charity in which we ask people to state how much they would donate to a charity that helps the poor if they receive uh, are the winners of a lottery in which 10 respondents are selected at random. We're going to have 4 treatments. The first is a control with no information. The second, we're going to give them information about how much the bottom 50% is taking home of the total income generated in 2018. The third is going to be information about how much the top 1% is taking home in 2018. And the fourth is this monetary incentive in which for each answer that respondents give within 5 percentage points of the true proportions of how much the top 1% and the bottom 50% are taking home, you're going to pay an additional dollar. So what are our results? So when we provide people with information about how much the top 1% is taking home, we see that there is a significant reduction in their belief of how much they believe the top 1% is taking home. But when we provide information about how much the bottom 50%, or when we give them incentives to overcome their cognitive and ideological biases, we see that they believe that the top 1% is taking more than in the control condition. Now, similarly, when we measure people's beliefs about how much the bottom 50% is taking home, we find that when we provide information about how much the top 1% is taking home, people suddenly state that they believe that the bottom 50% is taking much more home. And when we provide information about how much the bottom 50% is actually taking home, or when we give them these monetary incentives to overcome their biases, we see that there is a reduction in how much they believe the bottom 50% is taking home. So basically, when we provide information about how much the bottom 50% is taking home, or when we're giving these monetary incentives, people believe that there is more inequality, whereas when we provide them information about how much the top 1% is taking home, they believe that there is less inequality. So what impact does this have on our main outcomes? Well, we find that there is no impact, right? If we look at the diff and diff, which is highlighted in gray in this table, the effect of the treatments on changes in perceptions of fairness, desire for taxation, and aid and donations to charity by the rich and spending by charities is basically unaffected. We also find that there is basically no effect on people's willingness to donate to charity, both at the intensive and the extensive margin, right? So, and then we further analyze whether different subpopulations might be actually responding different to the treatments, and across a number of different covariates that we believe by reading the literature might have an effect on how people react to these treatments, we find that the effect is still that there is no impact on changes in people's redistributive preferences. So basically, what do we find? That information about inequality and incentives to overcome biases changes people's perception of how much inequality there actually is. And however, these treatments have a limited effect, at least in our sample, on people's perception of how fair inequality is and on their redistributive policy preferences. And it basically, the bottom line being that preferences for redistribution are hard to change just with information alone and with monetary incentives. Thank you so much. It's been great to present to you. I look forward to your comments and questions.